Hello everybody, an exceptional new documentary from Motus TV, and this is a present from us to you at the end of the year. Remember a couple of months ago a special onboard camera programme with Patrick Tambay as the consultant? Well, it was a huge success and a lot of you have let us know that you enjoyed the programme. So we've decided to follow it up with this, a second edition, and since it's not a good idea to change a winning team, we're pleased to welcome back Patrick Tambay back with us to go through 16 new sequences. I wanted to ask you a short question in place of the introduction. It's true that when we watch this kind of program, we get the impression that it was fabulous at the time on these circuits in the 80s, let's say. Great circuits, great drivers, enormous courage. In short, we get the impression that it was better than it is now. Is that true?
C'était des grands circuits avec beaucoup de courage qui étaient nécessaires pour les piloter, avec des pilotes qui avaient beaucoup de courage. On a l'impression que c'était mieux avant que maintenant. Est-ce que c'est vrai?
Well, I'm particularly nostalgic, he says, about the time. It's true that it gives me enormous pleasure to see these pictures again. They are witness to my career, to a particular era, and an occasion for me to see the drivers that were against me at the time on some mythical circuits. Makes us realise that we were very avant-garde, ahead of our time, if you like. Enormous progress has been made on the circuit since then, and the onboard camera technology has made considerable progress as well. But as far as courage is concerned, we were no braver than today. Even if the circuits are not as safe, even if the cars were not as safe than they are today, we were just as rash, just as flamboyant. Basically, drivers, they were the same then as they are today.
Par contre, sur le plan du courage, non, on n'avait pas plus de courage à l'époque qu'aujourd'hui, même si les circuits étaient moins sécurisants, si les monoplaces étaient moins sûres qu'elles ne le sont aujourd'hui, on était tout aussi inconscients à l'époque qu'ils le sont aujourd'hui.
Ok. Allez Patrick, on va vite.
Okay, Patrick, let's get straight to the heart of the matter. We'll use the same equipment. I'll click on the mouse, and we're off for the first sequence, and this is a surprise, and it concerns you.
Well,
the first thing I can see is the narrowness of the circuit. I recognise Imola straight away on board the Renault, and in principle that helmet is Prost, or not Prost. He's in a McLaren in front. Well, note that little bit of white sticky tape on the tyres. That's one of the problems on the circuit at Imola. At the time, they hadn't yet modified the track. We really had to work on the brakes, on the speeding of the brakes as well, the spreading of them as well.
Et c'est un des problèmes techniques de ce circuit Imola à l'époque, avant qu'il n'y ait des transformations sur le tracé. Eh bien, c'était de vraiment bien travailler son freinage.
So not the easiest of places to drive.
Un circuit essentiellement de consommation.
It was a circuit where the main difficulties were fuel consumption and brakes, as we've mentioned. Then we came into the Tosa at great speed, and you needed very good brakes. I'm in a warm-up lap, a running lap for the brake pads and discs, and this is Aqua Minerale, where the second part has been completely transformed, not in the second part, but in the first part with the deceleration chicane. At the time, the circuit was essentially a high-speed circuit, very fast, lots of braking, and the Variante was just about the same. No doubt the edges were higher than they are now. That morning there was a bit of fog, which is rare. You can see it on the onboard camera, and so the track was relatively slippery. And we went past Alain Prost earlier, and I think we're coming up to Niki Lauda. McLaren's did really well that season. Good performance due mainly to the quality of their engines and electronics as well, in a period when the rules were limited.
De leur moteur, de leur électronique. On était en période de réglementation limitée. Il y a un moteur turbo qui était
And here you see a turbo engine giving up the ghost in the first warm-up lap. A pity for the driver. I can't see who it is in the fog, but the 1984 season was a great season for Lauda and Prost, who took the World Championship.
Donc une grande saison pour Lauda et Prost, avec un championnat du monde à la clé.
En tout cas, donc, on vous avait réservé
Well, the
cette
first
première
sequence
séquence.
was
Déjà,
for
c'était
you
assez fort.
anyway,
Effectivement,
and since it
Imola,
was
un petit peu
strong
sous la pluie, on
stuff
va
with
dire qu'il y a
Imola in
absolument
the
très
rain
peu de
and
c'est
then
vrai
the
que
engine
c'est
exploding,
tout de suite une
it
vision
really
sur la
gives us
bonne
an
place,
idea.
on voit rien,
Let's put
le
ourselves in your
on
seat and
montre
say,
rien.
I can't see
Bien,
anything.
oui, on s'habitue
There
à ce
must
genre
be
d'incident,
some
on est
frightening
préparé.
moments with
En
fog.
l'occurrence, là, c'est un
Well,
moteur
you get used to that
frais
kind of
avec,
thing, you're prepared for
peut-être
it.
des
In this
pressions de
particular case, the
suralimentation mal
engine was cold and
réglées
perhaps
et
the
un
overdrive
turbo qui
pressure
lâchait
was
au
badly
niveau
adjusted, so the
Allez,
turbo
deuxième
just went.
séquence, on n'avait pas eu ce circuit lors du
Okay,
premier
second sequence.
numéro.
We didn't
Donc,
have this
on
circuit in
le
our first
découvre.
program,
Il s'agit de
so let's see it
Jean-Pierre
now. We
Jabouille à
have
Buenos Aires.
Jean-Pierre
Eh bien,
Jabouillet
oui, sur le circuit de
and
Buenos Aires,
Buenos
un
Aires.
immense circuit de très haute,
An immensely fast
de très
circuit
haute,
with this combination after the
vitesse,
pits,
avec
right
cet
and
enchaînement
left.
après les stands, droite,
And here
gauche.
too, the
Là aussi,
circuit
le
has
circuit
been
était
transformed
très,
a lot.
très transformé et on ne part
We no
plus,
longer go
vers
towards the end of the
cette,
circuit
vers le
with
bout du
those huge
circuit,
right-hand
avec cette
bends.
immense,
You
courbe
also
à
have to
droite.
put the circuit
Aussi,
into its context.
situer le circuit. Là,
Those who've been there will
ceux qui
remember
sont allés
there was a
s'en souviennent,
stretch
il y
by a
a-
rubbish
il y
dump
avait
at one point, and then each time we
une
went through
zone
very fast
de
right-hand
dépôt
bend,
d'ordures.
the smell
Chaque
was
fois qu'on
really
passait dans cette
terrible.
double courbe à droite, très rapide,
So a long corner, a long
de-
curve to the
des
right,
odeurs
which now
nauséabondes
rejoins
étaient
the new
vraiment
track.
très, très importantes. Donc,
Corner,
un
a
long
bit
virage,
like the
un
Osterkurve at
long
Hockenheim.
courbe à droite qui revient sur maintenant le nouveau tracé. Donc, un virage
Well, your
qui
car had to be
ressemblait un
perfectly
petit peu à
adjusted
l'Oscar
for the big bends,
de
and the car had to
Hockenheim.
perform
Il
well
fallait
at
être,
top speed with a lot of
parfaitement
power
réglé dans cette grande courbe
and
et avoir, une monoplace,
gear use.
très, très performante
It was
en
a
vitesse
case
de pointe.
for Renault.
Beaucoup de puissance et de
And
motorisation. C'est le cas de
Buenos
la
Aires,
Renault. Et là,
a
on se
track
retrouve
that's
un petit peu
much
sur le
slower these days.
de
Jean-Pierre
l'actuel
Jabouillet
circuit de-
is having a
de
few
Buenos
problems
Aires.
going in, and
Avec toute
you can
cette
see the
portion
problems with the
beaucoup
new turbo
plus
engines.
lente, beaucoup plus
It was their technical debut, if you like. They took time to respond and get things right. The drivers of that kind of technology were right on the edge and were often quite handicapped by it.
qui débutait, qui faisait ses débuts techniques, c'était d'arriver à avoir un temps de réponse qui vous permette de réaccélérer, d'anticiper la réaccélération.
Where you had to anticipate
D'être,
re-acceleration
très-
and be very efficient in
très efficace en
anticipation, really,
anticipation,
right
et
the way
dans
through
les
this
virages
track,
lents notamment, eh bien,
particularly in the corners.
les pilotes qui utilisaient ce genre de technologie étaient handicapés. Ici, dans l'épingle à droite du
Well, Buenos
qui
Aires
ramène,
circuit
vous
makes
voyez
us
comme
remember
il se vire
Jacques
aussi,
Villeneuve,
qui
who
ramène
had
sur
triumphed shortly
le
before.
gauche des
He's
stands
no longer
que l'on
part
voit à
of the
droite,
Formula
et
One
on
World
va y
Championship, of
rentrer.
course.
Voilà. Et donc, ce circuit Buenos Aires, on se souvient que Jacques Villeneuve...
After the new circuit now, Patrick,
récemment,
off we go to South
et,
Africa.
Buenos Aires ne fait plus
We're in
partie
1983 and our
du monde de
host,
Formule 1. On a
Alan
plus l'honneur
Prost.
d'accueillir cette manche du championnat du monde de Formule 1. Nouveau circuit maintenant, Patrick. Alors, direction, je vous le dis, l'Afrique du Sud. Nous sommes en 1983 et notre hôte est Alain Prost.
Oui, alors là, c'est
Yes, with Alain here.
Kyalami, n'est-ce pas?
Certainly Kyalami, with his immense straight on the South African circuit. You really have to hold the left. You can see it's marked by this exit from the pits during a long distance right up to the end of the straight, where you have to brake really hard. Afterwards, there's a combination of very fast corners. And it's true that the circuits had a tendency to have many more of this kind of big corner than they do now. This immense left that came next, particularly delicate to take.
Qu'ils ne les ont aujourd'hui. Et là, c'était ce droite-gauche immense est très particulièrement délicat. Là, on arrive sur...
We're coming into a slower section, which is just behind the pits below, and it too consists of a long right-hand bend followed by a medium left. And you can see that the adherence is excellent here. This is essentially a circuit for engine performance.
On voit que l'adhérence est excellente là-bas.
Here's a
C'est
right
essentiellement
that
un
climbs
circuit de
with a
performance,
compression and another
de
climb towards a
motorisation.
hairpin to the right,
Un droit
the
en
slowest
montée
on the
avec
circuit.
une compression et une remontée vers une épingle à droite, virage le plus lent du circuit.
In 1984, I ran out of petrol just after this, a few laps before the finish. Then comes the long Kyalami straight, and this really is a circuit that essentially needs high speed and power with good braking stability for this right turn and the combination of big fast corners as well.
De très haute vitesse et de puissance avec une bonne stabilité au freinage ici pour ce droite avant l'enchaînement de grandes courbes rapides.
Oui, là, on est parti pour un deuxième tour.
We're off on the second lap. Concerning the altitude, we know that it's a pretty high altitude. Does that make a lot of difference? Well, loss of power for atmospheric engines. The turbo engines were a bit less handicapped than their direct competitors, especially in this combination of long corners, which needed a perfectly balanced approach and a very efficient chassis.
toujours sur le fil.
Well, we're still in the trajectories. We can hear Alain Prost changing down and using his turbo engine in a big way because the ratios were long for this circuit. The corner left, he's going into a second, and it was difficult when handling the gearbox, especially in the Renault. To be efficient when changing down was difficult. It was a car that was hard to drive on this particular technical domain. And we can hear the turbo engine really working hard.
Des rapports. C'était une monoplace assez difficile à piloter dans ce domaine technique. Et on entend les coups de boutoir du moteur turbo.
Voilà. Alors avant la séquence suivante,
For the next sequence, which is really good, a quick question. Were you always interested in the history of Formula One? When you started, did you know about Fangio and his achievements? Did you know about Jim Clark and the others, let's say?
Est-ce que ça vous a intéressé?
In a rather superficial way, yes. Fangio, Jim Clark and his accident at Hockenheim, they had marked everyone's memory. I think that was the case, but I wasn't really passionate about the history of it. What I really loved was the technical side of driving. The rest came afterwards out of interest for my sport, but not to begin with. Nowadays, I meet some drivers, youngsters who are starting off and who have no real culture about the history of their sport, although they are passionate about driving and the technical side, just as I was when I was younger.
Mais au départ, n'ont aucune valeur, aucune qualité. Et un petit peu comme certains pilotes actuels, j'en ai rencontré quelques-uns, des tout jeunes qui arrivent et qui n'ont pas de culture particulière sur l'histoire de leur sport pour lequel ils sont passionnés.
Faut-il trouver ça
Well, do you
normal?
consider that this is normal or something of a pity?
Non, je crois que ça dépend.
I think it just entirely depends on the circumstances, on people's individual background and their personalities.
Pas de signe particulier là-dessus.
Bon, alors en tout cas, un des grands
In any case, we're going to see a bit of one of the great champions of the past, Jackie Stewart. And I'm going to ask you not to say anything because Jackie Stewart is commentating this lap of Brands Hatch himself.
Brands Hatch, et Pierre, ça n'est pas n'importe quel circuit, hein, vous serez d'accord. Brands Hatch, superbe circuit. Et c'est donc Jackie Stewart qui nous commente ça en direct. Allez, on regarde.
We come to the start finishing line of this lap. Put it into fourth gear for Paddock. Off camber, left-hander, bit of wide. Put the power down in fourth gear. Brake hard into third, up into second, down into second, in for Druitt. Plugging the curb all the way round, the flag, the power. Back in, straight into fourth gear from second, because it's downhill. Applying the power. Going along the bottom behind the pits, down into third gear. Long left-hander, a tight, tightening corner. Car understeers a bit. Flag the power. Accelerating along. The outside of the car, braking hard. Fourth gear now, what used to be Hawthorns. Accelerating along in fourth gear. Traveling into third gear. Into third gear for this corner. Accelerating and into fourth gear, down Deer's Leap. Into third gear again for a tight right-hander corner over the curb slightly. Accelerating hard, down into second gear. Opposite lock into third gear. Into fourth gear, going towards the bridge, braking hard. Into third gear. And right at the end of the...
Well, it makes you realise what hard work it is, both from a breathing and a cardiovascular point of view. You can feel the tension mounting, the rhythm of Jackie's voice accelerating. It's one thing to do it at a standstill and quite another in the car. Note too the circuit at Brands Hatch, very difficult British circuit, which with Silverstone is at the heart of the whole history of British car racing. There's a lot of danger at Brands Hatch with a few metres of grass on one side and then the rail. It can be very tricky.
De part et d'autre avant le rail, circuit très délicat.
Et une séquence d'autant plus remarquable.
A sequence that is even more remarkable since it dates from 1978, officially 5 years after Jackie Stewart's retirement. So he climbed back into a Formula One car for the occasion, and it's a priceless document. The next sequence, a much criticised circuit, as we all remember. This is Mexico with Philippe Strafe welcoming us aboard. A circuit that received the wrath of all concerned since it was bumpy and dangerous. Yes, a great historic circuit with a surface, and that is not quite obvious, that is not smooth, and gave you enormous problems with grip. Look how the circuit is so dirty. In fact, right from the very first laps, you can see that there are problems with the grip. High altitude circuit too, with long portions at high speed, and the turbo engines at the time had an advantage on this kind of track. But you can see that the surface is worn, old and dirty, and this made it difficult to drive Formula One cars here. See the problems that Philippe Streiff is having to master his car. And extreme conditions really for everyone taking part here. Very difficult along the longer stretches. Big circuit, famous parabolic as well. Long corner to the right before the pits is slightly curved and banked. Very tough technically.
Un des landmarks de ce grand circuit, c'est la fameuse parabolique, oui, qui est le long virage à droite avant les stands, légèrement incurvé avec un banking. Là, c'est toute la portion la plus éloignée avec cet enchaînement de courbes qui ressemble un petit peu
This is the most distant portion, with its combination of curves that are a bit like those in Hungary. It was difficult to get into the right gear at the start, still on this long right turn, which was difficult to master. As you can see, there was a lot of pollution, and the pollution can also be seen on the camera screen itself. A very good track apart from its surface, with an interesting profile. There would need to be an enormous amount of investment to be made to bring it back up to standard. I competed there in 1989 at the wheel of a Jaguar, and it was just as difficult as it was at this time on camera.
Premier virage à droite avec cet empilage de monoplace, la piste très glissante et donc un enchaînement de virages droite-gauche.
Very slippy track, difficult to master.
On voit qu'il y a beaucoup de pollution aussi à cette époque-là.
So much pollution. Of course, you daren't touch your visor, otherwise it would just smear. So you just have to let those little black spots keep on growing until you got to the pits and maybe changed the visor on your helmet.
Particules de pneumatiques et d'huile dans le tour d'installation.
It was basically just debris and oil thrown up off the track by the car in front.
Son revêtement avec un profil intéressant. Il y a énormément d'investissements, il y aurait énormément d'investissements à faire.
It was an extremely interesting track to drive, and it's a shame that it's been left to degrade as it has.
Avec au volant d'une Jaguar, et c'était aussi difficile qu'à l'époque.
Et ce circuit, effectivement, lui aussi ne fait
The circuit is no longer part of the World Championship calendar either. In the first of these documentaries, there was a sequence that really struck our viewers. It was Montreal in the rain with Patrick Depailler. Remember, the track seemed to have been polished. Well, we're going to return to Montreal, but this time in normal weather conditions. I will join René Arnoux. Get back into the Canadian spirit. With René Arnoux, we're already going at good speeds. Right, left, first of all, modified since then. Long right, modified following the accident in 1986. There's the right-left that I remember, with the pits now on the inside of the left-hand side of the track. Well, this portion hasn't changed. Then comes the little corner to the right, which always creates the same problems of speed and grip, with some hard braking for this right-left chicane, where Jean-Pierre Jabouet was to have a very serious accident just soon after this. And then this right, where Olivier Panis also had a very nasty exit from the track. Well, the course hasn't changed for this chicane. It's the one that governs the return towards the tunnel. The portion hasn't changed at all. The surface is just as delicate. The winter is hard at Montreal, and here under the tunnel there's always this little bump. The safety measures have been modified when it comes to the sandpits and the piles of tyres at the track extremity. And that used to be the entry to the pits, and we used to be accelerating hard in the front of the pits. distance before these very difficult right-left corners, with one just before coming into the fastest stretch. Actually, I think it's rather a pity to have lost these corners, even if they were very, very difficult and very dangerous to go through, and even for the track officials to control. It was a hard track to race, that's for sure.
Même si elles étaient très délicates et très dangereuses à passer et à contrôler pour les commissaires de piste.
C'est vrai que
Well, it's true that the track was very narrow. You take it really fast, as you can see. Truly, the typical impression of a dangerous circuit, a circuit that is delicate, difficult, and is not really giving too much grip. Grip problems there were in the early days. Whistling that you can hear, that's the carbon brakes working when they're not at their ideal temperature, and when they've not properly run in these rapid stretches. Really are doing well. It's well known Montreal is the most demanding circuit for brakes, well, a great circuit for brakes and for fuel consumption strategy, essentially because of a small problem of gearbox control or gearbox ratios. This technical element is always a weakness in the use of a turbo engine, for example. Modern technology with sequential gearboxes with a turbo engine, that would have been ideal, that combination. We're still on the American continent at Dallas now, a town with a Grand Prix that's marked mines, mainly due to the heat, the surface, all that happened there as well. Here with you again. Well, you seem to be enjoying it, but I'm not. Here we have a circuit that was a real test at the formats of the American circuits. Blocks of concrete, protective fencing, a very narrow circuit. This was at the time when Bernie Ecclestone and the FOCA, FOCA, were trying to find a home ground for a Formula One Grand Prix in North America. There was Dallas, there was Phoenix, Las Vegas, and Detroit.
Chaque Grand Prix avec plus ou moins de bonheur. C'était à l'instigation de Chris Pook, un promoteur et un organisateur américain très efficace. This
particular Grand Prix has its own history because it was very hot in Dallas and the surface didn't stand up to the longer races on that day. Second day it began to break up, a bit like it did in Belgium at Spa a few years later, and we had enormous difficulty in keeping our cars on the track. It was a real nightmare. Note the narrowness and how difficult it is to control the car equipped with a turbo engine. I think it was Keke Rosberg who won this race with an atmospheric engine. Yes, a real nightmare to drive here. Yes, I didn't take many pleasant souvenirs away from this particular circuit. So one for the atmospheric engines. You know it all, my dear Patrick. To conclude the first half, let's join Patrick Depailler at the wheel. And it has to be said that Patrick Depailler with an onboard camera is quite something. We're going to join him on a very prestigious circuit with a pretty surprising view on the car that has remained in more than one memory, the six-wheel Tyrrell.
Qui est restée elle aussi dans toutes les mémoires. Donc là, c'est la totale, Patrick. C'est Patrick Depailler à Monaco avec la Tyrrell à 6 roues.
Ah, c'est Monaco. Donc, oui, effectivement.
It is, of course, Monaco with a car that was hugely intriguing and which gave its drivers the pleasure of driving something pretty exceptional. The technology wasn't avant-garde and it was designed by the Tyrrell stable that didn't hesitate in their choices with ELF. Look at the little wheels in the front, which obliged Goodyear to work on a very unusual casting. Note too the enormously wide turning angle at the hairpin and then at the Porsche.
les petits trous à l'avant. Donc,
Watch the work of Patrick's feet under the tunnel when it
à
comes.
travailler sur des enveloppes tout à fait particulières. On aura remarqué l'énorme angle de braquage à l'épingle de l'Oise, ensuite au portier. On peut aussi observer le travail des pieds de Patrick Depailler, ici sous le tunnel. Une technique de pilotage vraisemblablement bien différente. Ils avaient,
Yes, technically
en théorie,
very different from the other
estimé qu'il y
cars.
aurait moins de surface, de résistance, pénétration dans l'air, qu'il y aurait peut-être une empreinte
This
au
Tyrrell
sol,
has no bodywork
des
for the
pneumatiques
needs of the
plus
camera.
importantes que sur,
It's
un
obviously
pneu-
very
un pneu
spectacular.
unique.
Changing
Donc,
down
ils
by
étaient
hands.
partis dans
This
cette-
is a
dans
pretty
cette
precise
voie.
example of the work the
C'est
drivers had to do
une
before the
Tyrrell
introduction
dépourvue
of
de carrosserie
electronic
pour les besoins
sequential
de
gearboxes
la
back
prise
to
de
the starting
vue.
points, and it really is a fabulous sequence, it has to be said.
Rétrogradage à la main. Là, c'est un exemple bien précis, bien réel du travail que les pilotes devaient accomplir avant l'introduction des boîtes séquentielles électroniques.
Et le retour au point de départ. Mais là, vraiment une séquence fabuleuse, il faut bien le dire. Patrick, on marque
A
juste
great
une petite
sequence.
pause.
Thank
On
you
se
very
retrouve,
much.
tout de suite
We're going
pour
to take
la
a
suite.
short break, but we'll be straight back.
Nous sommes toujours avec
Well, we're still with
Patrick
Patrick Tambay in the magnificent studio belonging to our friends at the AF-AVA, where we will continue watching these magnificent sequences from our onboard cameras. Patrick, we're going to see a sequence from 1978 with you after the debuts. I wanted to ask you a question about your debut, your starting point. You started in Formula One with the Ensign team. What are your feelings at the time? Well, before we get to that, let me just say this is a marvellous studio. It's like Ali Baba's cave. But to come back to your interesting question, the career that a driver both then and now attempts to succeed in, it's hard to even be given the possibility of being an official Formula One driver. It's a mix of different elements when you start, of lucky circumstances. It's very hard. And in retrospect, I realise that I was extremely fortunate to come in at a moment when Elf was setting up in the filière. We had great support from them with the arrival of Renault and all the good relations between the two companies, Elf and of course the Formula One world.
C'est très difficile. Avec le recul, je me rends compte que j'ai eu énormément de chance.
Yes, a whole series of factors need to come together to actually give you the chance of becoming a driver at the highest level. It's not just about skill. Everything has to be in place.
Un soutien très important de leur part avec l'arrivée de Renault et puis tout un relationnel que Elf ont.
Well, the way that everything came together, our whole generation benefited, and it is much more difficult today because there are a lot of problems. At that time, there was a lot of personal hard work to be done, a lot of using your relationships, your connections, if you like. I think if anything, that's even more the case these days. Well, I met the director of Theodore Racing and Ensign right at the start of the year, and it was necessary to do some financial dealing with him even then. The sums were not the same as they are now, and he followed this initiative by putting a second car at Ensign at my disposal, and it went well right from the start.
Et l'année prochaine, l'année d'après.
And the year after, you went to McLaren, and that is the sequence that we're going to see here. At the time, it was perhaps not the right choice. I had two options then at the end of 1977. First of all, to join Ferrari, Mauro Forgieri. I can witness to that because he was the originator of the negotiations and discussions. And then I signed with McLaren and I met Teddy Mayer and Philip Morris in London, and they offered me a contract, and I was a bit surprised. The first meeting with Enzo Ferrari had been cancelled, and I had said to myself that I wasn't going to hang on, I was going to take any chance that came my way. They made it understood that I would be teammate to James Hunt, former world champion, and with the McLaren team in full expansion, that was going to work really well. Meanwhile, at Ferrari, Carlos Reutemann, well, relations would have been more difficult than with James Hunt. As well as that, Ferrari was going into Michelin tyres and were probably going to have a difficult season. So I made a choice that I regretted later, not in 1978, but more particularly in 79, since the McLaren wasn't a good car, whilst that year Ferrari, with their Michelin tyres, had an extraordinary season with Scheckter and Villeneuve. In 1982, I was given a second chance.
Que j'ai regretté ensuite, pas en 78, mais particulièrement en 79, puisque la M28 était une voiture ratée. Puis cette année-là, Ferrari avec les pneus Michelin a fait avec Scheckter et Villeneuve une saison extraordinaire. Et bien l'histoire dira que plus tard, en 82, j'aurais eu une deuxième chance.
En tout cas, donc là, on vous a suivi.
In any case, we followed you at the wheel of this McLaren in 78, and it was on the circuit of Zandvoort. Next sequence, back with Philippe Streiff. And we're in Hungary, and we didn't see this circuit in the first edition. The Hungaroring, welcoming the Formula One in 1986. It's a circuit that is still in use today, but which has taken a lot of criticism.
Aujourd'hui, mais qui subit quelques critiques.
It's a circuit from the modern era. Jerez was designed, and the Hungaroring was designed to almost the same specifications. That is to say that it had to be 4 kilometers maximum, there had to be numerous corners, it had to be somewhere that lent itself to spectators, and where the spectators could see the cars as closely as possible. Speed shouldn't be too high, so that no one got too far in front, and it had to be no more than 4 kilometers, so as to have a high number of laps for the spectator quality.
Avoir un nombre de tours important pour la qualité du spectacle.
That said, there was still a lot of problems, however, and here it was the first year in 1986, and Philippe Streiff at the wheel of the same car as in Mexico. And it was a complicated season. We were just coming to the end of the turbo engine era. In 86, I was at the wheel of a Lola Beatrix Ford with Adrian Newey as engineer and Ross Brown in the factory, a team set up by Teddy Mayer and Carl Haas.
Ross Brown à l'usine, Neil Otley,
A very low-speed circuit which was not favourable for a turbo engine. With modern technology, the proof of the onboard cameras that we have today, we can feel the difference in rhythm, even if this is only a warm-up lap, and Philippe Streiff is not yet at top speed.
En pleine vitesse encore pour Philippe Streiff. Le circuit est exactement le même qu'à l'époque, il n'a pas évolué.
The circuit is exactly the same as it was at the time. It hasn't developed, except in the quality of the surface. This is the first day, and we can see a lot of dust and difficulty in finding some grip. At the start of the session, there is an oil spill from the car that had just gone past. First corner to the right, exactly the same as it is today. The left-to-right combination as well. After the first race, this stretch was later modified. As you can see, it was much too slow. We complained about the lack of speed and the lack of acceleration. The rhythm really was very slow, and so this stretch of the circuit was redesigned. And this part, though, is part of the circuit that has remained as it is now.
Et donc cette portion du circuit a été revue. Par contre, ici, on est sur une portion du circuit qui reste identique.
Same chicane now, same problem, same combination called the snake. Vision impaired by oil from Nigel Mansell, we see. At the time, we didn't yet have the film and roll that cleaned the lens.
Je me régale déjà pour la séquence suivante, Patrick, car on
Now let's get back with Depailler. You've no doubt guessed that we have a small weakness for Patrick Depailler at the wheel of these onboard cameras, since we know that he goes really fast, and we're off to Brazil and Rio. And here we go, quite something, very unusual circuit. It goes anti-clockwise, so it turns mainly to the left. It's the beginning of the year, so neck muscles are not yet fully developed. We didn't do as many winter trials then as they do these days. It really was an unbearable Grand Prix in physical terms, not far below 40 degrees as well, if not more, at sea level, with very high temperatures, very high humidity. The drivers and their teams, it really was a difficult race.
Une température et surtout une humidité très élevée, et c'était vraiment pour les pilotes, tout comme pour les accompagnateurs, tout le monde, un Grand Prix très difficile. Voici la longue ligne droite avec les.
This is a long straight with the stands which were taken down after the parade of the Samba schools and installed at the circuit at Jacarapagua. And this left turn is very difficult for the neck muscles, especially those on the left, which were subjected to real torture. Everyone tried to hold onto their helmets in one way or another. Note the right-hand side of the cockpit in the Tyrrell, kind of rather summery tube installation. Everyone tried to refresh themselves as best they could, and in 1978 I was a victim of a blackout here. Used a kind of cooled bib to try and help matters. American NASCAR technology with cooled water and a system with a little windscreen wiper motor. Despite that, a certain moment, we both suffered blackouts, very dangerous.
Avec un système de petits moteurs électriques d'essuie-glace et l'échange thermique du cœur avec le chaud, le froid, le chaud, le froid. Enfin, à un moment donné, on a eu tous les deux le voile noir.
Ah oui, c'est pas rien quand même. Oui. Bon, bah dites donc. Séquence suivante, Patrick. Alors là,
now for the next sequence, Patrick. Here too, a circuit that we didn't visit during our first edition. It's the Nürburgring. I wanted to ask you another question. Have you already completed, or competed, I should say, on the Nürburgring? Since here it's obviously a new one. Well, I was lucky enough to do so in 1976, a race at the European Formula 2 Championship. That was won by Jacques Lafitte. I was second, and it was on the big track. Here we are, one of the classic circuits at the Nürburgring that we know today, with the hairpin in the distance, the hairpin in the big stadium. There were rather less stands then, and the entertainment structures at the time weren't quite as big as they are now. Now they're much higher, far more numerous, but the track is the same. That year was the inauguration with this very fast right-hand combination, which is just as difficult to master today, but it's where you can gain time, and I think it's awful return chicane may no longer be the same, if I remember rightly.
La même, si mes souvenirs sont bons. Elle a évolué une fois ou deux ici, une McLaren.
Well, here's a McLaren, and there's still some wet patches.
Voilà, elle est quand même beaucoup plus ouverte qu'elle ne l'est aujourd'hui, avec un ralentissement aujourd'hui plus important.
Much more open than it is today, and you have to slow down more. Long rights, bringing you back onto the straight by the pits, which still entails the same problems, understeering in particular. There's the same balance problem as well going into the right-hand corner. Next sequence is of Alain Prost at Dijon. This is nice because it was here that he claimed his first victory, but it also, I'd like to ask you a question about the relationship between the drivers. Alain Prost, as we all know, is the most prestigious of drivers, with the most important list of wins of any driver in the world. Were you ever jealous of him?
Est-ce que vous avez pu être à un moment donné jaloux, par exemple, d'Alain Prost?
Oui.
Yes, I was jealous of him, and of others as well. To be in the right place at the right time, where circumstances allowed him to be behind the wheel of the McLaren in 1984, when we should have been teammates. The circumstances were unusual, jealous, even a little envious. But we all make our choices, and some make better ones than others at different points in their careers.
Peut-être un peu envieux, mais enfin on fait ses choix aussi, et le talent c'est de savoir faire les bons choix. Et certains en ont fait de meilleurs que d'autres à certains moments de leur carrière.
Et est-ce que plus globalement,
more widely, you were friends with other drivers all the same.
Il y a de bonnes relations.
Sure, we all got on well. As with any human beings, there are those with whom you get on better than others. With Alain Prost, I always had a good relationship. With Gilles Villeneuve, I was particularly friendly, however. It went further than just good relations. Now, with age, since we have all aged, we get together with our memories to share, and we have a much stronger relationship. We belong to the same club, and we survived that period, which is more than can be said for everybody. And that means our relationships are different now to those we had at the time.
À cette époque-là, ce n'est pas le cas de tout le monde, et ça crée des relations différentes aujourd'hui de celles que nous avions à l'époque, c'est vrai.
So, as we said, Alain Prost is on the circuit in Dijon for the first of his 51 victories. What was the circuit at Dijon like?
Alors donc, ce circuit de Dijon, comment faut-il le considérer?
Je remarque déjà,
well, you can always see that on Alain Prost's Renault that the front wing is moving a lot, so there's a problem with its installation. Here we are in the combination of historic corners that everyone remembers. Historic fight between René Arnoux and Gilles Villeneuve. They're generally very fast races because Dijon is a high-speed circuit where the Renault Turbo engine with Jean-Pierre Jabouillet won its first victory. And this is one of the slowest corners on the circuit with a compression to the right going uphill, where it's important to find good drive. And then after the corner to the left, we come into a very delicate combination of corners, a really difficult section. All the drivers who compete at Dijon will say it. These are corners taken at high speeds and on a slope, not flat out, but biased, and always difficult to get the right balance, especially in this right with a bump. A compression afterwards and all the conditions, the top speed on the straight as well combined. Yes, Alain Prost went into the pits here. Technically, very tough. A very short circuit too, surprising now, because a lap only takes about a minute. Well, now we're off across the Atlantic to Watkins Glen, and Didier Pironi at the wheel of a Tyrrell. Tyrrell, who at Watkins Glen had one of the saddest episodes in their history with Francois Sever's accident, when he was the leader of a young generation of drivers, and also the protege of Ken Tyrrell, Jackie Stewart and Francois Guiter. It was following the death of that elf youngster that the Filière policy was set up, and we can see how dangerous this circuit is too with its rail. The great lesson that Ken Tyrrell taught his drivers was that the most important thing was to finish, that above all they should drive their cars as if they were going between pieces of glass. And you realise here that with a 2-metre border of grass on either side and a rail that was badly fixed to the ground, the problems of security were underlined, and the enormous defect on what was otherwise a very pleasant circuit. I competed here much later at the wheel of a Bugatti in Guido Pastor's Monaco racing team, and the circuit had not evolved at all.
Et donc des problèmes de sécurité qui se sont trouvés soulignés.
No run-off space whatsoever before you hit the barriers. It really was very dangerous.
J'ai couru beaucoup plus tard, il n'y a pas très longtemps, au volant d'une Bugatti du Monaco Racing Team de Gildo Pastor, et le circuit n'avait absolument pas évoluer et changer.
D'ailleurs, sur le plan de la sécurité, il y a toujours une manche d'ailleurs.
There's always a round of NASCAR at Watkins Glen, one of only 2 road circuits used in the NASCAR Championship, which usually takes place on ovals. And we continue with you, Patrick, on the other side of the world this time. And Adelaide in Australia, with the round of the World Championships, which is always considered to be a very pleasant meeting with a great atmosphere.
Donc en Australie, pour une manche du championnat du monde qui a toujours été considérée, enfin moi c'est toujours ce dont j'en ai entendu parler, comme un rendez-vous très plaisant avec une ambiance formidable, c'était la fête un petit peu.
Yes, effectively, the Australians have fallen in love with Formula One, with a terrific ambassador at the time in the person of Alan Jones. Adelaide got geared up for a party to welcome the Formula One
se mettait
Just as Melbourne
fête
does these days.
pour accueillir la Formule 1, comme le fait aujourd'hui Melbourne, une grande rivalité entre cette partie de l'Australie et l'autre. Donc un circuit de toutes pièces fabriqué, un petit peu comme aux États-Unis.
Donc là, vous avez fait signe que... Oui,
Maybe we should explain to those who might not know that we are making a sign that means the driver can overtake you. I noticed a driver who was catching me up, and I was only warming up, running my tyres in. I was being careful. And what's more, at the time, we had onboard cameras but no television. And there was a sophisticated system installed on the roll bar during the first laps on the track. We took precautions mainly for the drivers coming from behind.
On prenait quelques précautions quand même, principalement pour les pilotes qui pouvaient suivre. C'était monté de manière très
It was still mounted in a very reassuring way, but the rhythm was not the same as we see with onboard cameras now. The wide borders too here is the entry to the pits, and the right with its very tight hairpin. We continue with a second lap with you on a circuit that is generally considered as being very successful for an urban circuit. Yes, relatively varied, natural track on a racecourse, a long straight with a few right angles, which are characteristic of this kind of modern urban circuit. As in the United States, it's the lay of the land that makes it what it is.
Moderne, comme aux États-Unis, c'est un petit peu la topographie du terrain qui veut ça.
Unless I'm mistaken, we've just taken the corner where Damon Hill and Michael Schumacher collided in 1994. Absolutely, and after this right, we're going into a long straight, and it was here that Mika Häkkinen went up onto the border and was thrown onto the left-hand side, onto the yellow tyre wall, and went into a deep coma. And here along straight we go to the right rather than sticking onto the left for the trajectory, because there's a lot of bumps. One of the problems, along with the drainage systems as well. We all remember some serious southern showers and terrible flooding. And here I get the steering and the braking all wrong, but it's the end of the lap, thank goodness.
Voilà, ici je rate carrément mon point de corde et mon freinage. Et c'est la fin de ce tour.
I wanted to ask you a question about Ayrton Senna. We can't get away from it. We have to admit he was the fastest driver ever in the history of Formula One. In any case, with the same car, he always went faster than any other driver. Do you think that this is true, and what is the explanation for that phenomenon?
Well,
there are a whole lot of reasons. Firstly, his professionalism, his talent, and I would even say his way of looking at a race. He imposed on his teammates, I think on all his teammates, the need to work much more seriously than they ever had before. A very methodical person, very hard-working, requiring long debriefing sessions. He was always looking for progress, rather like Michael Schumacher.
Un garçon très méthodique, très assidu, demandant de longues séances de débriefing, toujours à la recherche d'un progrès, un petit peu comme le fait...
When he had his approach to racing, which at the time meant he performed better than any other drivers. It was as simple as that.
À cette époque-là, le plus performant des pilotes de l'époque. Je crois qu'à son contact, Alain Prost...
I believe that contact with him meant that Alain Prost also worked even more professionally. He discovered a lot of things through contact with him. As an exterior observer, I think that he pushed his team ceaselessly, and he pushed his engineers and his technicians ceaselessly as well, much as Michael Schumacher does today, apparently, as all drivers today need to do. But do you have the feeling, given the innate talent, that it was difficult to be jealous of him in the end? To return to what we were saying earlier, that even other drivers were in sheer awe of him. Is that true? Well, yes, exactly. Right from the start, it was noticeable that Ayrton Senna had something unusual, rather special, in his relationships and in his behaviour as well. I've had a few personal anecdotes about that, and his arrival was accepted more or less as remarkable, rather like Schumacher's. When a young driver arrives and starts to drive, you know if they're going to be amongst the very best. And with him, this was the case. Right from the start, people like him are noticed. Some accepted it, others rather less so, conscious of a rival in their midst. Ayrton Senna was quite exceptional.
Ou seulement des bons. Donc Senna, Schumacher faisaient partie des très très bons d'entrée de.
Yes, in the shadow of such a man, it can be very, very difficult. He really was a very different kettle of fish altogether.
Voilà, donc Ayrton Senna tout à fait exceptionnel.
Et donc on va en profiter.
While we're on the subject, let's join Ayrton Senna at the wheel of this magnificent all-black Lotus in the streets of Monaco for 2.5 laps. Let's make the most of it.
Patrick, on va vraiment déguster ce plat.
Well, we're in the first warm-up lap. The track officials salute the drivers with their flags. They really enjoyed building friendly relationships. Ayrton Senna also worked on these relationships because at Monaco it is very important to be able to count on the competence of the track officials. Your life often is quite literally in their hands.
S'appuyer sur les compétences de l'ensemble des commissaires de piste qu'il faut saluer aussi. Et puis ce virage à droite du portier où Ayrton Senna va perdre une course un petit peu plus tard.
Here is a right-hand portier corner where Senna lost a race a bit later. He was the king of Monaco, but he did make a few mistakes. His list of wins is exceptional, but he could have taken it even further without the mistakes at Portier. Mistake caused by a lack of concentration. And it's so narrow, and these cars were much wider than those today. A lot of precautions were necessary. With much wider back tyres, it's still the same problem, of course, these days. The port chicane now, then the piscine combination, and here the Rascasse hairpin with Anthony Noge corner. I'm going to keep quiet now and enjoy it. Tyres are warm, he's off.
On remarque la grande difficulté.
Well, note the great difficulty of using a turbo engine at Monaco. There were no rules limiting power, and there was 1,400 horsepower with a Renault engine in qualification. And they completely removed the valves and added a cap in the place. The power was amazing with qualification tyres. Note the acceleration blast that Ayrton Senna gives to get the turbo into action and to get the power plateau and acceleration, the boost and pressure. And here is behind a Brabham, and you can see the difficulty of driving in these conditions.
Là, il est sur l'arrière d'une Brabham et on voit aussi toujours cette difficulté de pilotage, avoir à quitter le volant. Là, ça passait, oui,
Just look at him go. Very tight on the bump. The right hand frequently changing gear while trying to keep the wheel in the right place. Very tough.
Au bon endroit, et lorsqu'on compare avec un moteur ici, et j'ai l'impression que ça doit être tombé sur une Théodore.
Ah oui, faudrait voir.
Ce qui est remarquable, c'est la différence de rythme.
What is amazing is the difference in rhythm compared to the onboard cameras now, with 18,000 revs, sequential gearbox and almost automatic gear changes. The drivers are mainly concentrated on their braking efficiency, their entry speed on curves and anticipating acceleration. There really is a big difference in that.
Sur l'anticipation de l'accélération, même si aujourd'hui ils sont dans ce domaine aussi un petit peu maîtrisés ou contrôlés par les systèmes techniques d'anti-patinage. On voit vraiment de grosses différences.
Ouais. Bon, ben, c'est terminé.
Well, that's all for this second edition of this very special kind of program, and we had no hesitation in producing it with Patrick once again, and I think we made the right decision because it really was extraordinary, and your comments were, as usual, extremely welcome and interesting. Thanks for that. Patrick, thank you for coming, and we hope to see you again on Motors TV. As for you at home, thanks for being with us. It's bye-bye.
Et puis à bientôt sur Motors TV.
À bientôt.
Au revoir.